iHeartRadio Broadway, driven by Mercedes-Benz.
All the Devils Are Here is a one-man show. Well, it's called a one-man show, but really it's a 101-person show because I play the Darrell Roth Theater, which has 100 seats, and Shakespeare's soliloquies are interactions with the audience. So I use the audience as my acting partner, and every night is different. So it is an exploration of how Shakespeare developed the character of the villain. The character we call the villain of a play didn't exist when Shakespeare started writing. In fact, the word villain actually didn't mean back then what it means today. Shakespeare created the villain, and he starts with this tradition that he's handed by these old medieval morality plays of this character called the Vice, who wasn't even a person. He was kind of a personified sin. And slowly over time, Shakespeare keeps making these characters more and more and more human over a period of 20 years. And it's his investigation of why we do terrible things to one another. So he starts off with these great characters like Richard III. He has this breakthrough with the character of Shylock in Merchant of Venice and Falstaff in Henry IV. He has hilarious characters like Malvolio in Twelfth Night. And then later on, he realizes that people who do bad things also have a conscience. Many times with Claudius in Hamlet, sometimes have no conscience at all. That's the psychopath, which is Iago. And then he goes very deep and dark, of course, with Macbeth, which is the darkest play I think ever written by anyone. I started with this show because I had this sort of idea in my mind that it might be something fun to explore, and it was there for a long time, and it sort of sat in my mind until I came up with the idea, why don't I do it chronologically from the beginning of Shakespeare's career to the end, so the audience has the thrill of the development of these characters, how they grew and became more and more and more human, from those one-dimensional comic vices at the beginning of his career to these fully three-dimensional human beings at the end of his career. Not only that, but you get to see how his writing becomes more and more conversational and rich and idiosyncratic. So that was the initial idea. I then called a friend out in Utah at the Utah Shakespeare Festival and said, can I come and do it for you? I wanted to do it for high school students because high school students will give you a real reaction. They were having a conference of all these high school students. So I did it for 1,000 high school students because they will tell you through their boredom, through their rustling, through their laughter, what's good and what isn't. So I thought, okay, good. It plays for high school students. Now who do I need? So the next stop was Prague, because there was a Shakespeare conference of all these people who ran Shakespeare festivals and Shakespeare scholars. So I thought, okay, the kids like it. Can I get it past the scholars? So then I did it for the scholars and the artistic directors in Prague. I kept developing it, and then the pandemic happened. And so I called Simon Godwin, who runs the Shakespeare Theater Company in Washington, D.C., and said, might we do it during the pandemic? We made a film. And that film was hugely successful during the pandemic. Got these rave reviews that sounded like my mother had written them from the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on. And so then we thought, well, we have something here. But that was to an empty theater. And as I've said in the past, this is a show that entirely depends on the participation of the audience. So I said, I need an audience. So I began thinking about doing it in New York. And when I finished playing King Lear, which Simon Godwin directed in Washington, which became the biggest success of any Shakespeare they had ever done in Washington, D.C. And I thought, we're on a roll. So I asked Simon to direct. I asked Mara Isaacs, the producer of Hadestown, to produce, which thank goodness she agreed to do. And so now we're going to begin our previews. They're all so different. These villains are so different. So in terms of enjoyment, good heavens, in the theater, Iago is terribly enjoyable to play. Macbeth is the deepest in many ways. Shylock is in some ways the most human, the person who's put most on the spot. So each one of them has their, Malvolio is the funniest. So each one of them has something that I relish. In terms of other inspirations, it really works the other way around. So, for example, when I played Scar in The Lion King on Broadway, Scar is based on Hamlet's uncle Claudius. So I drew on Claudius in my portrayal of Scar. He's also partly based on Richard III, the fact that he's injured, the fact that he walks with a cane, the fact that he has that scar is based on Shakespeare's Richard III. So it actually has sort of worked the opposite way around, that the characters I played on Broadway, like Hades, like the Green Goblin, the Grinch, and Scar, I've drawn on my experience in Shakespeare in playing them. I was a fan of Shakespeare growing up. My father was an actor with the Oregon Shakespeare Festival when I was about 3 and 4 years old, so I used to sit in the audience in this spectacular replica of the Globe Theater out in the Oregon mountains and watch the adults up there on stage in costume in the golden light with the music and the dancing, and I thought, I want to be up there. And so I asked my dad for whatever I could get. I listened to recordings over and over again of John Gielgud's Ages of Man, Laurence Olivier's Henry V, and Richard III, and that became my great love and my great passion. When I went to college to study English literature, I studied Shakespeare in particular, and then I began working at the Utah Shakespeare Festival, where I stayed for 6 seasons and played some of the greatest roles in the canon. Then the Oregon Shakespeare Festival for several seasons, again where I played these great roles. And then I sort of went around the country playing them, playing Hamlet and Henry V and Richard III and so on at various regional theaters before I came to New York. So it's always been my desire to bring all of that to a New York audience, which is what we're about to do. The challenge of a one-man show is that acting really is a reciprocal process. You cannot do it by yourself. My performance is entirely created by what you do, by what the partner does in the scene. I have an acting studio in New York, and of course this is what I teach my actors. So how do you do that when you're alone on stage? Well, Shakespeare's soliloquies, and his villains have more soliloquies than any other characters in his canon, are written to be performed directly to the audience. And so the audience becomes my acting partner. And I'm playing off their reactions, off of their eyes, off of their smiles, off of their looks of horror or their boredom, if they have it, to try to get them back. So that's the challenge of a one-man show, is rehearsing when you don't have your acting partner there. So I don't get my acting partner until September 29th. Oh, the advice I would give to someone young who's trying to make their way in the business is the same advice that was given to me, which is be kind. There are a lot of people who are talented. There are a lot of people who are ambitious. There are a lot of people who have drive. And so it's the people that you want to spend time with, finally, that are going to rise in the business. And I've been astonished. You think that the higher up a person gets, the more entitled they might be. But I've found just the opposite, that the biggest stars I've worked with are some of the kindest people in the world. What is the most valuable lesson I've learned about the craft of acting? It is that you mustn't be attached to what you've done in the past. You must be there on the night that it's happening, even if you've played a role, as I've sometimes played a role like Scar or Lumiere 1,200 times, to try to be alert to the actual moment that's happening in front of you, so that you can give the audience a live event and not an impression of what happened last night.
iHeartRadio Broadway, driven by Mercedes-Benz.